I guess it's a good time to start. So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining the CSAE Development Economics Webinar. We're very excited to have a speaker today, but before I introduce him, let me set out some ground rules. Matteo is going to talk for 45 minutes. During this time, if you have any clarifying questions, can you please use your Q&A box to type in your question, and I will read those out to our speaker at a convenient time. At the end, we're going to have about 13 minutes for questions. And during this time, you can use your raise your hand button. And when we choose you, then we will unmute you so you can ask your question directly to Matteo. Today, I'm really excited to welcome Matteo Bobba from Toulouse School of Economics. He's going to be presenting teacher compensation and structural inequality, evidence from centralized teacher school choice in Peru. Thank you so much, Matteo. Very excited for your presentation. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thanks a lot for the invitation. Thanks everyone for being here. Let me start sharing my slides and see whether everyone can see them. Right. Can everybody see my slides?
Yeah, we can see them. Thank you.
Okay, great. So let's start. So that's a joint project with a bunch of people. Let me quickly introduce them before we start. So Camila is in the government of Peru. Tim is a very, very promising PhD student at TSC with me. Chris is at Princeton, and Gianmarco is at UPF in Barcelona, and Marco is in University of Cagliari in Italy. So lots of co-authors, lots of fun, hopefully. Let me start motivating this project. So there's very, very large inequalities in the access to quality education across the world. And this is probably a very well-known fact. What's probably more interesting and less known is that the same amount of inequality in access to school inputs and teachers and in other school infrastructure is present within countries and not just across countries. And in particular, it's even probably more stark from urban to rural areas within the same countries. And the idea is that this may come from the past, some historical leniencies that determines very unequal allocations of public goods and resources within a given country. And the presence of some public policies or welfare programs can actually improve or actually decrease the level, improve or worsen the level of inequality with complementary interventions. So in this paper, we focus on one specific aspect of school inequality, which is the presence of public school teacher, and in particular their compensation and their wages, and whether this policy can contribute or eventually alleviate structural inequality in the access to education. So we do this in the context of a very interesting country, which is Peru, Latin America, which I know this for the Center for Studies of African Economy is not probably the most suitable candidates, but I'm trying here to convince you that it's still a very interesting context to study this question. The reason for me trying to convince you is that Peru is a very, very large and diverse and heterogeneous country with a lot of differences across cultural, linguistic, and ethnic or racial traits. And there's a lot of geographic dispersion in this diversity, which we're going to use a lot and leverage a lot with the data in our empirical approach. And also, it's a very unequal country. Parts of this inequality is inherited from colonial times, and part of this, as I was saying before, is explained by current policies that actually make things worse instead of improving them. So why do we focus on wages or public sector wages? So the ability, probably I don't need to convince you in front of economist audience that wages are important to attract, retain, and motivate employees. What's probably more interesting is that the same price incentives that we think about in the private sector, of course, would apply in the public sector. The reason why this type of personal economics policies are less studied, in fact, now they're more and more studied in economics and in development in particular, but the evidence is fairly small with respect to the private sector, is that the instruments themselves are much more difficult to shift and to move. Usually public sector compensation schemes are rigid, and wages are usually do not adjust to these specific structural inequalities that I was mentioning you in terms of geography and local amenities. And as you all know from Economics 101, when wages do not adjust, workers sort along other dimensions, non-pecuniary dimensions of employment. And so this clear observations leads to an unequal distribution of workers, and in particular teachers quality across the country, and in particular good teachers sorting into the most the nicer and where places where there are more amenities, which usually are urban setting, and hence this sort of the presence of rigid wages actually exacerbate the existing inequalities in access to education. So these considerations are fairly general, in fact, and they apply to very different settings, including other type of public sector workers, like, for example, health professionals, that are very difficult to be induced to move to remote or very poor locations. But today we're going to focus more on teachers. So what do we do in this paper? We actually do three things, and I hope I will try to convey the three messages during the talk. But here is the quick preview in case I don't get into the all details of each. So the first thing we do is that we assemble a very, very large, comprehensive data sets, mixing up very detailed and micro administrative data on students, schools, teachers, vacancies in these schools, and the teachers' job application that actually cover the universe of the country. So we don't have a sample, we have the exact universe of all these entities. Using these unique big data sets, we document a large inequality in these schooling inputs, and in particular, very large inequality in access to qualified teachers across areas and regions in Peru. The second thing we do is that we leverage a recent policies that has been implemented in Peru, which actually changes discretely the compensation, the wages for working in specific remote and rural locations according to some known deterministic rules, which allow for a very straightforward regression discontinuity design. And so using this simple design, I will document some causal effects of increasing wages or this type of wage bonuses along a variety of dimensions on teachers. In particular, we will look at whether these incentives will change demand or teachers' application toward this specific location versus other locations. Through these demand effects, we will look at whether the quality of teachers that are actually assigned through a centralized mechanism changes because of these wage incentives. And finally, we will look at final outcomes in terms of student test scores and cognitive achievements to see whether the inflow of these relatively more qualified teachers induced by wage incentives changes the cognitive achievements of kids in these schools. So that's kind of the first part of the empirical analysis. And the second part of the empirical analysis, which is where I hope I will spend more time here, is that we actually estimate a school choice model. Usually, you probably have seen school choice models where decision makers are students. Here, we have school choice model where the decision makers are teachers. They have to decide where to go. And for this, we leverage this very stark features of the assignment mechanism that allows us to directly infer preferences from observed choices of these teachers. Again, for the universe of teachers that participates, thousands and thousands of teachers that participate to this assignment mechanism and recruitment drives. And using the model, we will try to understand better the effects that we find in the regression discontinuity design, and in particular, trying to understand why and how teachers move, how they trade offs through compensating differential wages with other locality and school amenities. And using the model, and that's probably the most important part of the paper, we will try to evaluate and propose different counterfactuals in terms of the wage schedule and wage incentives to actually further improve the allocation of teachers, and in particular, the allocation of talent and teachers' quality across the country, so that we tend to equalize the distribution of quality across different areas, whereby now the distribution is extremely unequal, as I will document in the first part of the paper.
Sorry, Matteo, there's a question from Julian. Can you take it now?
Yes, I'm happy to.
Thank you.
Hi, Matteo. This is really interesting, and I'm sure you're going to get to it. But should we think of it as, do you need some sort of qualification to become a teacher in Peru? So the policy is really about reallocating within the pool where people go, or should we also think about kind of more people coming into the profession to begin with?
There will be both extensive and intensive margin response, and I will elucidate them. To give you a 2 seconds response, most of it is intensive margin, especially because the policy is short term. If we look in 10 years, maybe there will be more extensive margin response. So let me delve into the first part of the paper, which is, as I quickly sketched before, assembling these very large data sets, which encompasses different sets of micro data sets coming from different sources. The most important, I don't have time here to get into, of course, in each of these details, but the most important aspects here, which is something that I will be leveraging a lot during the empirical part of the paper, is the centralized teacher job application or assignment system. That is actually in place since 2015, so that's relatively recent, and it's a centralized mechanism similar to the mechanism that you probably have seen for allocating students across majors or across schools in different settings across the world. This is done by the government of Peru to allocate teachers across the different locations and areas in Peru, public sector teachers. So here we observed the vacancies posted for public schools. In particular, we will look at 2 different waves of this recruitment drive, 2015 and 2017. We will observe all these teacher applications and a wide variety of characteristics of these teachers, including their score, their competency test, and their preferences. And then we will look at the assignment outcomes. So we can clearly map exactly from the demand to the teachers to the final assignment of the teachers in a given school using the deterministic process of the assignment mechanism. So that's the first data set that is very, very important here. The second one, and then I will probably not mention the others, is this sort of payroll panel that actually follows teachers over time in a very detailed fashion every 2 months, and allows us to track all the teachers' history, both before and after assignments in each school, in type of jobs, and their exact detailed earnings data, which we'll also use a lot during the empirical part. So let me sketch a few things about the context. So teacher wages in Peru are fairly low compared to other college graduates, which is something common in Latin America, but in stark contrast with other developing countries, including Asia. You probably know more about Africa, so I will be looking forward to listen to what you guys have to say about teachers in Africa, which I'm not sure I'm competent to assess here. The important thing here is that teachers are hired under 2 types of contract. There's a permanent sort of public civil servant contract, which is permanent, and then there's a fixed term contract teachers version, which is also very common in many countries, this 2-tier system, which is actually much more flexible. There's much more churning and mobility along this second dimension. Sometimes this second aspect is used as a stepping stones to become permanent, but as you will see, the assignment mechanism will ask you to participate again. You cannot use a position in contract teachers to become permanent. You will have to participate again to the assignment mechanism. These contract teachers are assigned for 1 year, and they can get renewed in their contract for a max of 1 year. So total is 2 years. to preempt a lot of questions that I usually receive, here we only focus on public schools. Private schools is a big deal in Latin America, as you probably know, although this phenomenon is largely concentrated in urban areas. Here we'll mainly focus on rural and poor and remote areas where public schools are basically the lion's share of the enrollment in these settings.
Sorry, Matteo, we have one more question from Carol.
Yes.
Hi, Matteo. So I was wondering whether it is common in Peru for teachers to give after-hour classes privately to students, to pupils, to make extra income this way, and if this is more prevalent maybe in urban areas than in rural places.
I don't know. I think it's plausible that they do. It's also plausible that they do other side jobs along their teaching jobs to sort of make up for further earnings. We don't observe this in the data. So we are largely we just discarding this additional dimension for the moment. All right, so there will be these three categories of rural schools that we will be looking a lot. So there will be an extremely rural dimensions, which basically very tiny villages far away from the urban capital. There will be a mixed dimension, which is rural, and then there will be moderately rural, according again to this population of the village and distance from the municipal capital. So this is a first description of the presence of inequality. Here on the left-hand side, there's the teacher evaluation. So this teacher score the competency score that teachers get when they participate in the assessment mechanism, and this is this tripartition of these three areas: extremely rural, rural, and urban, and how they are distributed according to teacher competencies. Of course, as you probably already imagined, these competency score are way below in rural areas, in particular extremely rural, and they're much better in terms of in urban areas. And on the right hand side, you see the exactly same distribution, but in spatial terms along the different provinces and areas in Peru. And for those of you who know a little bit the country, you will see that, of course, the better urban areas are those along the coast. And of course, Lima is the capital, where you see a lot of light green in terms of like better teachers, whereas the mountains region, and in particular the forest regions that are in the inlands, are those that are more rural and disadvantaged and remote. And this is the schools that actually we will look at, where the kids are actually having the worst sort of quality teachers teaching to them. And another important stylized facts here to preempt some of the question is that we will use a lot this competency score to actually approximate teacher quality. We cannot estimate value added for a variety of reasons that I will not get into this talk. But so there's been a lot of evidence now that this teacher competency score actually predict value added pretty well. And this is just a correlation, but taking into account all the school fix effect, because here we are looking at the teacher classroom matched pairs. So we are looking only at the within school variation to take out a lot of possible selection of teachers across schools that of course may invalidate this positive correlation. But of course you see that teachers that are more qualified produce students that have higher math, in this case test scores, but you can do the same for Spanish test scores. This is for primary school, by the way, and you'll see a lot of correlation saying that eventually these teacher qualifications that we use for the assessment mechanism actually capture some important dimension of quality that translates into student achievement. So that's the details of the centralized assessment mechanism. Again, there's a lot of gory details I don't want to get into. Here, I'm just giving you a quick outline of what this entails, because I think it's important to understand some of the estimates, and in particular, how we formulate the model, the teacher school choice model. So the assignment mechanism works roughly like this. There's all permanent teaching vacancies are posted in a platform. Teachers that wants to apply for this permanent position choose a region and rank up to 5 schools or jobs within each region. The mechanism assign up to 20 applications to each vacancy based on their score. So it's merit-based, based on this competency score, which actually varies by different specialties of the teachers in secondary school, but in primary school is actually common. I think the only variation is Spanish and math teachers. And then schools, there's a supply side, which is schools that they interview these top 20 candidates, select and accept and decide who they want, basically discretionarily, and then teachers decide to accept or reject their offers. This is the first layer. The second layer is this market for fixed term or 1 or 2 year positions that actually work similarly, except that there is no supply side here, in the sense that the teachers that choose a region similar to before, but then the system works as a serial dictatorship, basically. So basically, all the teachers are ranked based on their scores, and then applicants can choose sequentially based on their score from the available vacancies in order. And the unfilled vacancies at the end of all this process get resolved in a decentralized fashion to uncertified teachers. So both, to get to some of these probably previous questions, both permanent teachers and contract teachers are actually certified public sector teachers in Peru. Whereas after all this assignment takes place, sometimes the schools remains unfilled. Unfortunately, most of these schools are rural, and then they get unfilled with some non-certified teachers. Okay, so just to give you an idea about how teachers' demand is distributed and works, here you see the application for by teachers across the different areas. Again, extremely rural, moderately rural, urban. So these are for the permanent teachers. So we actually observe their top 5 rank order list. And you see that a lot of teachers in urban areas, so a lot of teachers like urban areas in terms of their rank order list, whereas a lot of teachers do not even list, in particular, extremely rural areas. This phenomenon is particularly stark for teachers that are above median here, which we call kind of higher quality, above median of their competency score. And here you see that up to 70% of rural areas do not get any application from these higher quality teachers. Whereas, of course, the same thing in terms of vacancies in urban areas, they get a lot more of applications and they get chosen first or second. So there's a lot of imbalance in demand, which is concentrated with this idea of amenities and heterogeneous preferences of teachers. So if you look at this demand, and then you try to back out the equilibrium, I give you directly the data. The recruiting process leads to only 35% of job vacancies for these permanent positions that are filled. So a lot of vacancies remained unfilled just because nobody demands them. At the same time, close to 80% of these positions are filled when the vacancies were in urban public schools. So there's a lot of congestions in urban schools and a lot of low demand in rural school. And in particular, this is striking given the very heterogeneous quality or evaluation or competency of these teachers, whereby really the better teachers sort themselves into urban areas and leave these extremely rural vacancies unfilled or filled with lower quality teachers. So last part of the context, and then we'll, if I'm still, I think I'm kind of going kind of slow, but we'll see how it goes here, depending on also the question. So the rural wage bonus policies, given this situation, the government of Peru decided to do something, okay? And so it takes, consider these 17,000 rural schools, and then say, okay, let's consider these wage bonuses for schools. And in particular, they set up the wage bonuses according to this very basically lacking demands in extremely rural areas, and in particular they gave higher bonuses for extremely rural areas, relatively lower bonuses for 5 to 7% for rural areas, and a little bit of bonus for moderately rural. This is all with respect to urban, where of course there is no bonuses. In extremely rural areas, so these are the bonuses for both permanent and fixed-term teachers, the bonus is fairly generous. It represents 30% of the earnings of contract teachers and roughly 20% of the earnings of permanent teachers. So we're talking about like a stark incentives, monetary incentives that is given through this policy. So these are the distribution of these schools. Those are the extremely rural schools. It's schools that are below 500 of population here. You see on the x-axis and above 120 minutes from the provincial capital. So you see them in dark blue. This gets 500 soles more, which is again this roughly 30% increase in wage bonuses. On the other right quadrant here, you see schools that are in the rural categories, that are schools that are above 500 in terms of in inhabitants, but still very far away in terms of the distance from provincial capital, or the other way around, they are below 500, but they are between 30 and 120 minutes from the provincial capital. Both criteria are include this rural category. And then all the other sort of rural schools are considered moderately rural, and these are depicted in green in this simple chart, okay? So this is just one discontinuity. And in particular, I'm showing you the discontinuity of moving from rural to rural in the 500 population threshold. And here we are, as I told you, we have detailed data on their payrolls, and we check that this wage increase actually match what the policy is saying. And in fact, this is a very precise 400 soles increase, or 500 here. And the same thing, so this is for the distance to the provincial capital, and this is the other one for the this is the 500 jump, sorry. It goes from going from rural to extremely rural, your wage increase by 500, from 1,600 soles to 2,100 soles. So we actually checked in the first, that there is a first stage along all these discontinuities. Here, I'm just showing you two of them, but we have many, in fact. So you probably now see already where I'm going. There's this very simple RD design lurking from the back here. And so before doing this, we need to check that there is no sorting around these thresholds. In fact, there seems to be sorting, and in particular, so these are the 2 years of the assignment mechanism, 15 and 17, and those are the two forcing variables, the population and the time to travel, and those are normalized to 0 at the thresholds. And you see that in 2015, very little things happened because it was the first year of the assignment, so there was little scope for manipulation. In 2017, some sort of funky thing happened, but the most worrying thing here is the distance, whereby so population is taken by the census is kind of difficult to manipulate. And if you think about it, this is a jump that is actually the other way around for manipulation. Is actually there's less school in the places where you get higher bonuses. Here, you see exactly the type of manipulation from the demand side that you might expect in terms of school principals, manipulating a little bit the GPS coordinates of their schools so that to become marginally eligible to get these wage bonuses that are very generous for these schools. For this reason, we discard this forcing variable as distance, and we only use population, and we will devise a sharp RD design only using the population cutoffs for understanding the causal effects of these wage bonuses along a variety of outcomes. So this gamma 1 coefficient is going to be the weighted average treatment effects of these wage bonuses. It's a weighted average because if you look at this graph, it's basically a population crossing from here to here. It will be population crossing from moderately rural to rural, and also it will be another population crossing from in the diagonal here for moderately rural to extremely rural. So this gamma 1 coefficient will capture basically a weighted average of this different increase in wages, where the largest one is the one that I've shown you here in the first stage. Sorry, I'm going pretty fast here because I assume RD is kind of bread and butter, but tell me if I'm too fast. So let me pause here and ask you if everything is clear so far. This is a simple unidimensional sharp RD that we teach to undergrad students or M1, Master 1 students or something. So that's why it's as simple as that. There is no weird thing here. And there's covariate balance in terms of along the population cutoff. A lot of covariates are very continuous above and below the population cutoff. So it's apart from this problem of manipulation that we detected on the distance side, population is balanced, and there is no manipulation in this dimension. And in order to estimate this, we use state-of-the-art minimum square error, optimal bandwidth, non-parametric estimators to estimate the gamma 1 coefficient consistently. Yes?
It seems clear. There are no questions.
Okay, great.
Thank you.
Either nobody understood anything or everything is clear. All right. So these are the results. So let me show you the results separately for permanent teachers and then for fixed-term teachers. Again, because these are two different assignment mechanisms that works according to different criteria. So the first thing to notice here is that a school that gets a wage bump receives more application. This is a roll, this is rank order list. So these are the top 5 choices that each teacher applicants submit in the system. And you see that it increased the probability that a relatively remote and rural school gets demanded in this top 5 order list. And the effect is pretty substantial. It's like 17% increase. And the mean of the dependent variable is right 0.76. So there is no sort of intensive margin effect on the portfolio. It doesn't change the order of the portfolio. It doesn't induce a highest preference here. And most importantly, the effects in these demands, the same, these schools get relatively more demanded in these portfolios, do not translate into the probability of that the vacancy will get actually filled and the teacher score of the assigned teachers in equilibrium. Why column 3 and 4 happens? Well, the reason is fairly simple, is this two-sided nature of the assignment mechanism for permanent teachers, which actually kind of dilute and offset the effect of demand through supply side responses on the schools, because as I told you, these schools are actually discretionary, free to, out of the top 20 list of candidates they can interview, to select whoever they want. And apparently they don't select these marginal people that eventually are sort of demanding more of these schools, and eventually they select someone else, and this entails in equilibrium into no additional probabilities that the vacancy is filled, and eventually no effects on teacher quality across the threshold. So this is on the permanent teacher side. Probably more interesting is what happens on contract teachers. So here, contrary to permanent teachers, there is no average effects. There are some heterogeneous effects that I will not have time to discuss here on vacancy filled. But then in terms of the how the system works, here is serial dictatorship. So we don't observe the preferences, but we observe directly the rank at which the assigned teachers, the rank of the assigned teachers in each match. And this, of course, decrease because these vacancies get filled faster, which is another sort of demand side effects. There's a very large effect on teacher score, which is also because there is no supply side here. The system is one-sided. So teachers are, these vacancies that gets a wage bump gets filled faster in terms of the priority by more competent teachers because they have a higher score, and hence the score increase or in the schools that have a wage bump. And the increase is fairly substantial, 0.4 of a standard deviation. So this is all standardized. And this is another way of saying that quality increase. This is the share of top quarters or teachers in the top quartile of the distribution. And this increase at the population cutoff by 13%. So that's a fairly large increase. It's kind of double with respect to the mean of the dependent variable.
Sorry, Matteo,
so
just two things. You have about 15 minutes left, and we also have a question from Julian.
Okay, can I kind of finish at least this RD very simple part and then move to, because I'd really like to get to the other parts, and I'm afraid that I cannot get to the end. Or Julian, or is it
Go
something?
ahead, that's fine. I'll ask it later, no worries.
All right, thanks. So let me just wrap up on this first part, which is vacancies, because of wage incentives, become more desirable. They're filled faster, and by teachers with roughly 0.5 standard deviation scores, higher scores. This happens only when school preferences are vertical, in the sense they sorry, in fact, this is a typo, should be horizontal, in the sense that they don't choose along other dimension than the competency score through the assignment mechanism. In the other mechanism, where in fact schools are allowed to choose, there are supply side responses that may have neutralized the demand side effect triggered by increased wages, resulting in no sort of equilibrium or sort of distributional effects on teacher quality for permanent teachers. We have a bunch of other results that I don't have time to discuss. Let me move on to the last part of the RD, which is looking at student achievements through the standardized math and Spanish test scores of students in the schools that receive wage incentives, whether schools or not. So the first column is actually looking at shutting down the selection margin, which are all these recruitment effects that are induced by the assignment mechanism, and purely looking at the type of efficiency wages type of story. Because another story may be, maybe student achievement increase just because all teachers are getting paid more in that schools, and they exert more effort and they teach better, and these schools are actually improving their test scores. Column 1 says that this is not the case. This is a fairly precise zero effects, whereby these are schools that are above the cutoff, so they get a wage bump, but they don't have a vacancy opened in these 2 assignment mechanisms in the 2 years. So the selection channels is totally muted, because these schools are not recruiting in these years, and only this type of efficiency wages channel is active, and you see that there is no effects whatsoever on student achievement. On the other 3 columns, you see that these are schools that have a vacancy, and you see that schools that have a vacancy open through this assignment mechanism have much higher student test scores, 0.3 of a standard deviation here. And if we divide these vacancies by permanent and contract or fixed term, you see that the entire effect is concentrated on fixed term, which actually makes sense because I told you that there's a lot of effects on sorting by quality for contract teachers, and there is no effects, look at column 3 and 4 here, of sorting of permanent teachers, partly due to the nature of the assignment mechanism. So all these kind of line up. There is little or no scope for efficiency wages, which is actually consistent with the recent QJE paper by Kartik Muralidharan and other co-authors, which is emphatically called double for nothing, where basically they randomize wages for teachers and they find 0 effects on student test scores. But in these settings in Indonesia, there was no effects of selection. There was only the efficiency side, the efficiency wage component. And here we exactly replicate the setting in Indonesia in an RD design in Peru, and we find the evidence that is very much consistent with that. Once you allow for the selection story to operate, the recruitment channels explain a lot of the effects on student achievement. In fact, it's explained the entire effects. And this is due by sorting of higher quality temporary teachers, as I told you, because those are the teachers that actually move because of wage incentives and get assigned through this merit-based assignment mechanism after the wage incentives. Okay. So that's kind of it for the first part of the talk. This is sort of showing all the different channels through these wage incentives in a causal fashion at the local, in the local region around the population discontinuity affects a variety of outcomes to teachers and eventually final outcomes of students. So I probably have 10 minutes, right, Margarita, the stage? Do I? Less?
Sorry, yes, about 10 minutes left.
About 10 minutes. But before moving to the model, as I know I kind of was rushing a little bit, let me ask if there is any question up until now.
We have one question.
Please.
Thank you, Matteo. That's very interesting. I was wondering if you know if, depending on the type of school, there is a difference in the allocation of teacher across classes, like teaching at the right level things, or do you know if there is any difference in the management of and the
within school or across schools?
Across school, like, do you know if better performing schools are also the schools where teachers are better allocated to students?
I think so there might be some scope of allocations across classes within a given schools based on the teacher characteristics, which I was asking. But for the majority of these rural schools, there's basically one class, which is a lot multi-grades class. So there is no, this argument is just there is one teacher teaching for the entire school. So all these arguments are kind of shut down and are probably more relevant for the urban, but for the rural school, there is not such considerations operating. The only dimension that we're looking at quality here is this competency score, which I agree is a very rough measure of what a teacher is. Eventually, we are all teachers, so we know that it's difficult to get collapsed into one specific dimension. But I told you, there's a lot of literature saying that this competency score map into a lot of sort of desirable properties of these teachers. Although here we don't observe them, so we actually reduce them into one specific dimension of competency. And looking at their scores, we look at whether they sort differently based on wage incentives. That's what we do.
And there is another question from Natalie Quinn.
So if I understood correctly, this is basically a distributional effect, as in we're shifting good teachers across this boundary. So presumably kids who are in schools just the other side of the boundary are losing out.
Yeah, no, that was and that's what one of the button here that I didn't push. So there is no evidence of sorting by quality from above the population cutoffs. You see that teachers are sorting in different places. Let me see if I have this. No, I don't have it. I'm sorry. But we have charts in the paper that actually show different beans of the population cutoffs in different places in Peru. And you see that this sorting of teachers is coming from very different places and not just from below the cutoff. So it's not as exactly a zero-sum game. It's a more complicated sorting that occurs geographically and not exactly from below to above the population threshold, if this is what you're asking. And the second thing is that it's not only, as Julianne was asking before, sort of a zero-sum game. You see that there's these teachers that get selected are younger, they're more likely to be novice teachers, and they're less likely to be experienced. So there's kind of an inflow also of new teachers into the system that are selecting in part of the wage incentive. So there is also an extensive margin response that actually is behind these reduced form impacts, and not just a sort of a reallocation effects within the public sector teachers in a given point in time, if you know what I mean.
I was going to ask a slightly different question about wondering what the magnitude of it was in relation to the magnitude of the underlying inequality, but I recognize you probably don't have time to answer that now.
There is a little bit this elasticity this is the implied elasticity of teachers' test scores with respect to wages. And then we have the same implied elasticity of student test scores with respect to wages. These are fairly high. And then with the model, we will decompose. So that's why I want to get to the model, because in the model, we will decompose more starkly the inequality and what the policy is doing. In the reduced form, you can actually do only half the picture, which is why we actually estimate models eventually to fill up the other picture. So let me get into the model now that I also motivated why we do it. So this is simple random utility model. We have a lot of heterogeneous dimensions of preferences along local amenities here, the XJ, along school characteristics, XSJ. We have this wage elasticity, which is the key parameter here that we'll be estimating. And this is also allowed to be heterogeneous in the population. And then we have a bunch of distance dummies, which is actually the distance from the location of the teachers to the location of the school. And these distance dummies actually will play a key role, as in any school choice model, for those of you who try to estimate it for students, but you'll see that it applies a lot for teachers. Now, there's a lot into this. I want to collapse all these dimensions here into one sentence, which is we use the serial dictatorship for basically generating a discrete choice problem with individualized choice sets based on priority indices, so that the choices that we observed will directly feed into, in terms of identification of the preferences in terms of this UIJ of the teachers. And the model can be nicely and easily estimated with the maximal likelihood estimator. So why the model is useful? Let me first start with this question. So we start to decompose and understand these teacher preferences and how these teacher preferences map, getting back to Natalie's previous question, into structural inequality, depending on their trade-offs, right? And depending on compensating differentials. How much do teachers trade off, for example, wages in a given location with distance? How much they're willing to move and commute to a different regions, but where the wages is higher? The model will give an estimates of this, and we will use these estimates to understand the reduced form impacts of before. How much do teachers trade off the same wages with local amenities or school inputs or school infrastructures or the type of students that they will teach to? And then after performing this simple comparative statistics exercise in the model, and we also kind of validate the model with the RD out of sample. But the most important part here is that we will use the model to do some counterfactuals, okay? And in particular, we'll try to understand what would it take in terms of wages, for example, to equalize the distribution of teacher quality across the entire country. And And we do this in different fashion, different ways. One is a more kind of partial equilibrium perspective, where we based ourselves ex ante from the applicant perspective. We estimate their indirect utilities for getting assigned to any school in a country. And then we basically shift wages to actually make people in difference across different school matches with different wages. And we kind of derive the wage schedule accordingly. So this is kind of a compensating differential argument. The second, which is a little bit more convoluted, is more like a pure equilibrium sorting argument, where basically we will iterate this serial dictatorship many times until we find some convergence in the wage schedule. And this will take into account all the equilibrium sorting that takes place when you alterate the wage schedules in each of these assignment mechanisms. So I don't know if and when I have time. So this is the distance. This is how much people trade off distance in terms of their wages. So if you, just to give you an idea, it will take kind of to pay someone 7 times their base wage to move 100 kilometers away from their hometown or from their. So there are 2 different distance metric. One is their place of residence, and the other one is their previous teaching jobs where they're located. And in both cases, these distances are extremely inelastic to wages. And because that's something I didn't tell you, but I should, because the distribution of teachers' quality is very unequal across the country. Now, basically, if you take this picture and the geographic distribution of teachers, you immediately understand the sorting that you observe in Peru, right? Because basically people are very unwilling to move far away, and also good teachers are in urban areas. So that means that it's very difficult to get someone, good teachers in rural areas based on these distance preference estimates. So that's another way of depicting DRD, but through the model. So these are the 2 dimensions of DRD, the population and the time to capital. And these are sort of the utilities that these teachers get in each space of population and distance. And this is the change in median utilities we using the current bonus that is induced. As you see, there's a lot of positive changes up here, which is places that are very far away from the provincial capital with very little population. So these are kind of the marginal teachers and schools are located around here. So that's another thing that we do with the model. We basically replicate the DRD. We estimate the model. We generate simulated data. Out of this simulated data, we generate the DRD, and then we check that the simulated RD match the true RD effects. And that's what we do in these 2 panels. And the model seems to be doing pretty well along these dimensions. So we can actually, this bolsters the confidence of the model in generating credible counterfactuals along a variety of dimensions. So that's the first type of comparative statistics exercise that we do. So this is the CDF of counterfactual wage bonuses that may be needed to attract an above median teachers in any location that is filled with a teacher below the median. So what we do is that we basically shift wages until we make the teachers indifferent between their current match and the match with their current school associated to the vacancy. And then because we do it for every teacher, then we take the minimum of this wage distribution for each school, and we plot the CDF across schools of these wage bonuses. And here you see a variety of trade-offs and dimensions upon which teachers make decisions. For example, look at remoteness. So this is again the distance to the provincial capital. So time to close a city being 0, this is urban. So this is the dark line. And you see that 80% of teachers with the current wage bonus, which is the vertical line, in these schools, 80% of the vacancies are filled with an above median teachers, which is again another way of saying that there's a very high demand for high quality teachers in urban areas. Now, to get to the same target of filling 80% of the vacancies with an above median teachers in a place which is 5 hours away from the closest capital, it will take a wage bonus of 8 times larger than the actual wage bonus. So this is, and the same thing you can do for poverty status, or you can do for students' achievement in terms of student quality. You can look at this type of trade-offs where basically heterogeneous preferences induce different sorting and the trade-offs between wages and this locality and schooling amenities. How much time? Little?
You can take a couple more minutes to wrap up, and then we can move to questions.
Wow. Okay, so that was the thing I wanted to talk to you about, but I can't, as usual. So that's the most complicated equilibrium counterfactuals, which draw from this matching with contract, very famous theoretical market design paper by Hatfield and Milgram. One of the papers that gained the Nobel Prize of Paul Milgram this year, in fact. So we adapt this matching with contracts algorithms in the context of Peru. We play several times the structural dictatorship, and then we derived the wage schedule that leads to equilibrium by moving wages. And this is truly equilibrium. So this is not truly equilibrium here because we're basically making an argument ex ante based on compensating differentials. So it's not actually what would have happened if you change the wages. Here, it's basically replicating the equilibrium every time. So you get all these displacement effects of teachers that would have been assigned to different schools, and then they get displaced by another higher quality teachers because of the wage incentives and so on and so forth. So we take into account what it is called equilibrium sorting. And this is, I think, one figures that I'd like to finish up with. This is the current policy. This is the share of schools with the teachers above in the top 40%. The top quartile. So you see that in the current policy, you have 40% of schools that do not have good teachers. And this is running this matching with the contracts algorithm. This is what we call the cost efficiency frontier. So basically, this is the best wage that you can get. So the wage that would entail the minimum amount of schools that remain unfilled with the good teachers. And here you see that the margin of improvement at the budget neutral, because here you remain exactly, if you draw a vertical line here, you will get exactly the same total cost of that current policy. And you see how much you can improve if you go to the cost efficiency frontier. You go from 40% of schools or more that remains without a good quality teachers, this percentage goes down to like 25%. So this is how much you would gain by shifting the wage schedules in different ways and incentivizing teachers, taking into account heterogeneous preferences, so that you basically almost equalize or improving the current allocation of teachers across the country. And this is a map telling you this is what happens with the current wage bonus. And this is what we call the optimal policy, which is sort of different wage bonuses that along in budget neutral sense with sort of change the wage schedules to sort of improve the equilibrium spatial distribution of teacher quality across the country. I think I don't have any more time. So let me wrap up. May I or not?
Yes, of course.
All right, so let me wrap up. So I think we understand the presence of structural inequality in access to teacher quality, which is produced by a combination of different factors that are very important. The first is heterogeneous teacher preferences for school characteristics, community amenities, location, and in particular the distance and wages. The other component is the geographic distribution of school and community characteristics, which is widely unequal in Peru. The third thing is the geographic distribution of the stock of quality teachers, which is also wildly unequal in Peru. And the fourth important component is that there is a rigid wage schedule, as often the case in the public sector, that basically misallocates resources around dramatically. So we present causal evidence that a current existing policies in Peru is doing something good in terms of moving teachers in the right direction, but we have a model that quantifies these teacher preferences and this trade-off and suggests that this current wage policy is doing something good, but is clearly insufficient and can be done much better in order to improve the process of spatial allocation of teachers and compensate more higher quality teachers and for inducing them to move to rural and remote areas and eventually equalize the distribution of teacher quality and getting more opportunities for poor kids in rural areas.
Thank you so much, Matteo. Now, if you have a question, can you please raise the hand button, and then we will unmute you and you can ask your question directly. Thank you. We've got one question from Carol Mazer. Go ahead, Carol.
So Matteo, again from me. So I think, two questions. So I was wondering about kind of correspondence between the empirical and structural part? Because in the empirical part, you drop this forcing variable of distance, but then you include it in the model. So is it correct that you can do this because you do indirect inference and you control for selection in the model?
No, we don't do inductive. We do maximum likelihood, so it's even easier. But we don't need the sort of manipulation on the time to travel, because we use the entire variation in wages, not just the local variation in wages around the discontinuity. So even if people sort endogenously around the threshold, we don't care in the model, because we use the entire wage variations, not just the RD variation.
Okay. Okay. And then I was also wondering about this counterfactual. So in a way, this counterfactual, the main one is very Rawlsian in its nature, right? So you
Which one?
The Milgram algorithm thing.
Mm-hmm.
So you improve these outcomes for these kind of worst of schools, places.
Yeah.
But that's not a Pareto improvement here, right?
Yeah, it's purely inequality based. It's true. It's very Rawlsian. So we have this objective function where we want to impose that these basically the distribution of teacher quality gets equalized. That's the planner objective function. Mm-hmm. And if you're worried that by stealing out teachers from urban areas and sort of inducing them to move to rural areas, you actually make urban kids worse off. This is not the case, because you have an excess demand of teachers in urban areas. So you have always a very large pool of teachers in urban areas, even after the wage incentives can move, so that always schools in urban areas get filled with the right teachers. But instead, some of this excess demand in urban areas gets moved into rural areas thanks to these wage incentives.
So I think I didn't get this. I mean, of course, because you went quickly through this, but what I from what I understood is that the algorithm shifts the extra wage income that they can make between areas. So like there were these increments of 20-30%, and you kind of play with these margins, how to reallocate.
No, sorry. So we play with much more. we increment the wages up to, I don't know, $1 million. So it's not that you play only with the 20% increment. The current policy is one realization of the sequential serial dictatorship, and then we keep on playing serial dictatorship by moving wages of different increments. This is what he's saying in these slides, until you get an equilibrium, and every time you reiterate the process.
Okay,
so
but the point in the plot you showed was, you said that was budget neutral, right?
Yeah, because the total amount of wages, although of course some people get higher wages in the counterfactual and some people get lower wages in counterfactual, so the overall, it's kind of a zero-sum game. Mm-hmm. And the total cost of the policy in terms of the wage bill that it entails in millions of soles, as I said here, can be, I mean, of course, here we draw the entire frontier for much more expensive policies. But what I was just mentioning, that if you want to remain budget neutral, you can still improve a lot the allocation of high quality teachers into rural and remote areas just by shifting wages. And basically, this is what I didn't say, but let me take this into account. So you basically incentivize people according to different components and not just the rural components. In fact, what the optimal policy is saying is that you should decrease the bonus of this rural one, and in fact redistribute these rural one bonuses along other dimensions that are in fact very important in terms of heterogeneous preferences that would make teachers sort in the right directions. Okay. Thanks for this question, because it has allowed me to say something else.
We have time for one quick question. Julian, would you like to ask a question?
Sure. So thanks, Matteo. It was like really, really useful. I just kind of have two very quick ones. One is, so you showed that this like the density looks a little funny starting in 2017 for one of the cutoffs. Mm-hmm. And I was wondering, is that something due to the fact that like there's more actually vacancies opening in some of those schools? Because maybe, you know, a school only opens one, but then, you know, then you start to see that you can pay people more and you're getting more applicants. And so maybe there's more. It would be good to see if the schools respond by opening more vacancies.
No, this is actually something we check. I don't have a button here, but it is in the paper. The probability of opening the vacancies is continuous around the threshold.
Cool.
If this is what you were asking.
Yeah. And one thing, I don't know if you can, I mean, it might be tricky, but an alternative policy would be, given that people are so unwilling to move far, at least once they're there, could you like have a policy where teacher training centers actually spread across the country?
Thanks. This is exactly what we are doing here. So
okay.
Here, basically, we draw the cost efficiency frontier for the status quo, but then you can draw many cost efficiency frontier with complementary policies. For example, if you increase the share of teachers that are good in rural areas, you can see that these things becomes much flatter, and you can achieve a much better objectives with less money, because you have a complementary policy that induce sorting with teachers. So we're working on this additional complement. I think it's something I mentioned here, but I didn't have time to talk here. Complementary policy may further improve allocation, still working on it. So thanks again for asking. This is clearly on the agenda. Another complementary policy is, for example, if you equalize school inputs across the country, imagine, or equalize community amenities, how much this cost efficiency frontier will be drawn. So with complementary interventions that make people move into rural areas irrespective of wages. And we have all the data, and we can just replay with this matching with contrast algorithm with different counterfactuals, basically.
Cool. Great. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm afraid we're out of time, so I'm going to just wrap up here. Thank you so very much, Matteo, for this very interesting presentation. It's been fantastic to hear you speak. I just want to mention that next webinar will be on Wednesday, same time, same place, 1 to 2 p.m. UK time on Zoom. And our next presentation will be on agricultural transformation and farmers' expectations, experimental evidence from Uganda. And we hope to see many of you there. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot for everyone. Bye-bye.